Hi, I'm Matt Saintsing, Assistant National Communications Director for DAV, and you're going to be hearing a lot more from me here. We'll be bringing to our listeners stories of service and sacrifice, and we'll be keeping you up to date with the latest and greatest within DAV and the veteran community. And to start, there's been some recent movement on Capitol Hill with a few pieces of legislation that would expand VA care for veterans who endure toxic exposures, like burn pits. So I decided to sit down with Shane Learman, Deputy National Legislative Director for DAV, to get to the bottom of just what is happening here in Washington, D.C. So Shane, thank you for making the time. I'm wondering if we can start with what exactly are toxic exposures and why should the veteran community and the general public care?
Well, toxic exposures have existed in the military space or in conflicts and wars pretty much since the start of America as a country. You can go back to even look at some things that were used during the Revolutionary War and even in the Civil War that were hazardous at those times. And then maybe more recently, World War I, there was mustard gas with huge negative impacts to veterans, specifically respiratory problems. And then we roll forward to World War II. There was biological chemical warfare. We talk about the atomic age during the 50s as well as. Sure. So we're talking about a lot of toxins and hazardous environments our veterans have been exposed to. And then we bring it all the way up through Vietnam, contaminated water domestically, Persian Gulf, and of course, OIF, OEF, Afghanistan, Djibouti, burn pits. Veterans are getting ill, not just because of combat, but they're getting life-threatening diseases from these toxic exposures, which will negatively impact themselves and their families pretty much the rest of their lives. That's why everybody needs to be aware of this. Has been a long-term issue for America's veterans, and I don't foresee toxic exposures themselves stopping now and will continue to be a problem in the future.
Wow, well, it really sounds like that soldiers and service members being exposed to harmful substances seems to be a characteristic of warfare and something that, as you say, the United States has been dealing with, or maybe not dealing with quite full-frontly since the birth of our nation. But I know one example of toxic exposures we touched on a little bit was Agent Orange exposure to Vietnam veterans. Now, how does the experience of Vietnam veterans impact the different various legislation today?
Well, quite plainly, burn pits, a burn pit exposure, toxic exposure is being referred to as this generation's Agent Orange. That really is a very accurate description from the point of view of Agent Orange was used starting in the early 60s all the way up through 75, 76 in some locations. And we didn't start seeing any real legislation taking care of these until the early 90s. So from the first time of exposure till it passed, that could have been almost 30 years for some veterans. Fast forward to now, this started, you can lump in the first Persian Gulf and some of the burn pits and toxic exposures there up through now. That's again been 30 years, and there hasn't been an overabundance of diseases added as presumptive or conceded to those exposures. And that's where the comparison comes in, is we learned a huge lesson, or we should have learned a huge lesson as a nation about the impact of Agent Orange, but yet 20, 30 years later, we still don't have anything definitive as far as comprehensive toxic exposure legislation to take care of those veterans now and into the future.
Yeah, so that brings us to the activity in Washington, D.C. Now, I know there are various pieces of legislation that DAV supports. Can you briefly describe some of the legislation that's kind of floating around there on Capitol Hill?
Oh, absolutely. There really are two very large comprehensive bills. There's one in the U.S. Senate called the Cost of War Act, that is S3003. And that is very comprehensive. It's about 13 or 14 different bipartisan pieces of toxic exposure legislation combined into one bill. In the House, there's a similar bill called the Honoring Our Pact Act, that's HR 3967. And it's very similar. They're not identical, but they're very similar, and they're larger bills composed of smaller bipartisan pieces of toxic exposure legislation. Now, right now, the big news really is the Honoring Our Pact Act just passed the House of Representatives on March 3rd. So now that is being looked forward as it's ready to move to the Senate. What kind of actions are the Senate going to take? And the reason this really is such a big bill and a big piece of legislation, why it is so important right now, is because it will take care of so many things. Not only will it address burn pits and add potentially 23 diseases related to burn pit exposure, but it'll also provide health care for veterans exposed to toxic exposures. And it will add hypertension as a presumptive disease to Agent Orange. As we said, we're still not done with Agent Orange. So this will add hypertension as a presumptive disease for that, as well as concede exposure to burn pits and toxins, provide a new framework for establishing future presumptive diseases, and it will expand radiation risk activities to include veterans who participated in the radiation cleanup at Inawataka Atoll from 1977 to 1980, and veterans exposed to cleanups at Palomar, Spain. Now, it will go even further. It will also add additional locations for conceded use of Agent Orange to include military installations in Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Guam, America, Samoa, and Johnston Atoll. And it'll even create registries for veterans exposed to toxins at Fort McClellan and for those exposed to PFAS chemicals, which is like a forever chemical found in over 600 military installation drinking supplies. This really is a huge bill in the fact that it will address multiple eras and multiple generations of veterans. So this just isn't a post 9/11 toxic exposure bill. This is going to have a sweeping impact on all generation of veterans. We're fiercely advocating for it to get passed in the Senate, just as we did in the House and asked all of our members to get involved and engaged. We really think this is probably the vehicle we can get toxic exposure, comprehensive toxic exposure legislation done yet this year before this Congress ends in December.
Interesting. And you kind of mentioned that these bills are kind of overarching and will include not just, I know in the media, it's been known as the burn pits bills, but it's so much more than that. I have to ask, are these competing bills? If supporting one, will that make sure the other is dead? Are these going to be, is one of these going to beat out?
Well, we support both bills, and we support a majority of the independent pieces of legislation that were added into both of these larger bills. I don't believe that they're going to compete against each other in the sense of the Senate appears to be having a problem getting the larger Cost of War Act passed. So they were looking to break it down into 3 phases, which would be very similar to the overarching package. The Honoring Our Pact Act passed with bipartisan support in the House. And I think there's over 40 VSOs and MSOs, military service organizations, that support it. VA has come out in support of Honoring Our Pact Act. So I don't want to say they're competing. I just think Honoring Our Pact Act is in such a better position, already passing one of the chambers, to really be the vehicle that may get us to the end.
Gotcha. And this is something the president has even mentioned during his State of the Union address. He suggested that his own son, Bo, who was in the military, his rare cancer may have been caused by burn pits.
And our troops in Iraq in Afghanistan have faced many dangers. One being stationed at bases breathing in toxic smoke from burn pits. One of those soldiers was my son, Major Bo Biden. I don't know for sure if the burn pit that he lived near, that his hooch was near, in Iraq and earlier than that in Kosovo, is the cause of his brain cancer, the disease of so many other troops. But I am committed to find out everything we can.
And so the bills you said will impact past and present generations. What about future generations of veterans who are not yet exposed? I know we kind of touched on this a little bit, how it is not an aberration to have a toxic exposure of military service. So I can only imagine this is going to happen in the future conflicts, or even just future military at home with this water contamination. Does legislation touch on that?
That's a great question, Matt. It does. It considers how to change the way that VA looks at in adding and considering or conceding future exposures for veterans down the road. And DAV has developed some independent thoughts on this, along with our partners over at MOA, on really, we need to take a look at really what's happened over the last 100 years. How is that going to impact veterans in the future generations? I think the main thing is it shouldn't take more than 20 or 30 years to develop a presumptive when we don't have enough evidence to grant direct service connection. That's why these presumptives are so important. It shouldn't take that long. We shouldn't be waiting. K2 veterans is another prime example. They were exposed from 2001 to 2005 in Uzbekistan. And we knew in 2002 they were exposed to horrible things. Here we are, and it's almost 20 years later. It is 20 years later from their first exposure. We still don't have anything really in legislation for them. That's why developing something for the future really is important. And to your other point, we don't know what those exposures are going to look like in the future.
Right.
So we need to write this in a way so it's not just toxic exposures. I know there's been a lot of talk about potential problems that are experienced in some embassies across the country where they're developing headaches and nauseous symptoms, and some people believe they may be hitting with sound or sonar or things. We need to contemplate those for the future, as well as potentially psychological attacks in the future, because we don't know what these exposures are going to look like. So we need legislation that can handle that, so we're not constantly coming back to the table to make sure veterans are being addressed adequately for their access to healthcare and the benefits they've earned.
So does the Honoring Our Pact Act and the Cost of War Act, do either of those or both of those include the future generations as well?
Well, they add in some framework to take a look at how we consider those going forward. So it does go, from that point of view, is forward looking. However, they're not looking at anything specific yet because we're not to that point.
Sure, of course. And we talked a little bit about it earlier, but you mentioned presumptives and a concession of exposure. What does it mean that the VA presumes someone was exposed to a certain chemical?
Well, that really is a part of it. I can just real quick. The most common way a veteran establishes a disability related to service, which is kind of the gateway to all the ancillary benefits, healthcare and education and everything else, is through direct service connection. We got to prove three things. We have a current disability. 2, we can point to something in service. And 3 is a medical link or an opinion saying it's at least as likely as not our current condition is related to that event in service that we can point to. Presumptives come into play when we have gaps in that information, and toxic exposures is a huge part of that, because we're never going to know when and where a veteran was exposed to a toxin, like Vietnam. If a veteran was physically in Vietnam or certain areas offshore, they're conceded to be exposed to Agent Orange, and any subsequent disease related to that, if they manifest it, will be established service connection, because we're never going to know certain things. That's why a presumption is so important, and the concession of exposure is too. Conceding they were there and exposed removes barriers and burdens from veterans trying to prove that. So when we can't prove direct service connection, conceding exposure and establishing presumed diseases is a huge part of this process to make sure veterans have access to these and don't have long-term suffering without assistance because they were exposed to horrible things on active duty.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's way easier to prove you were physically in the combat zone than to prove individual exposure. But as you say, if the VA, if you can just prove you were boots on the ground or in eligible waters in Vietnam and you have any of these diseases, the VA will presume you were exposed. And as you say, that kind of unlocks benefits and compensation.
Exactly. And we're trying to establish that for burn pits. And that's why a part of honoring our PACT Act would concede that exposure in certain locations or with certain metals, and would also concede what they were exposed to, the actual defined chemicals or particulate matters. So that's why it's important. We're trying to get that established now. To be quite honest, it already is too late. So we just can't wait any longer. So that's why we've been pushing on this legislation for several years. DAV has been in the fight on burn pits since 2007, and we haven't let up. Hopefully, we get it done yet this year.
That's right. DAV was actually the first veterans charity to let the media know in 2007, 2008 about the issue of burn pits and how important it's going to be, not only during the war, but maybe perhaps even more so in the years after, where we haven't even begun to see what the full effects are for veterans that were exposed in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places around the world, specifically with burn pits.
Oh, exactly. It really, for some veterans, they don't develop these cancers until
decades later, right?
Right. Some of them, the average time frame to develop them is between 8 and 10 years.
Oh, wow.
Some's longer. You look at Agent Orange exposure, some of those diseases don't manifest till 20, 30 years. So it's really hard to say how long some of this is going to take. There is some science out there establishing it, but again, it might be too soon to really tell. That's why getting the legislation in now that can help establish these will make it easier in the future to establish additional diseases when the science shows there is a positive association between that exposure and that disease.
So we've got these two big bills right now. One's in the Senate, one's in the House. What are the next steps that veterans can do right now to get involved?
Well, I think honoring our PACT Act is really the big mover at the moment, as we talked about the big vehicle. And again, that is HR 3967 that just passed the House on March 3rd. Now it's up with the Senate. So if a veteran wanted to get involved, reaching out to your member of the United States Senate, your two senators, and letting them know how important it is that we get this passed. It appears there's going to be potentially a hearing on March 29th in the Senate to discuss honoring our PACT Act. So that's going to be very important as well, because that's going to help set the tone on the way the Senate looks at this bill and how we move forward.
Perfect. Well, Shane, I really appreciate you being with me here today. And I would also encourage any veterans out there to get involved with DAV's Commander Action Network. You can go to davcan.org to look at not only these pieces of legislation, but all the other legislation DAV supports. Pick up the phone, call your senator, call your Congress member, get involved. It's something that veterans fought to preserve, and they should absolutely continue to do. That's all for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll continue to follow these important bills, and we'll keep you up to date on their status. You can learn more about toxic exposures and other issues impacting veterans at dav.org/resources. I'm Matt Saintsing. Until next time.